Under the stark, fluorescent lights of Denver International, a voice cracked across the terminal like a whip. "Ma'am, step aside." Now, head snapped toward the security lane, where an elderly woman, her hands trembling around a metal cane, stood frozen as an agent barked at her, as if she were a threat instead of someone's grandmother. The public watched quiet, complicit. Only one person moved, Eleanor Grant. She moved without hesitation, the way someone moves when they have spent a lifetime knowing exactly when a line has been crossed. But no one knew who she was not yet. Not here. To them, she looked like any other middle-aged traveler in a charcoal coat, her silver-streaked hair pinned neatly her presence, unassuming. A woman you could overlook. A woman many already had. She stepped closer, the rubber soles of her flats whispering over the tile. The security agent didn't notice her at first. His attention was locked on the elderly woman, whose voice shook as she insisted she had already removed her bracelet. Eleanor watched the agent's jaw tighten, the way people did when anger wasn't about the moment in front of them, but all the moments beneath it. His breath came sharp, impatient. He snapped again. "I said step aside." It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Eleanor felt that old pressure in her chest, the heavy one that used to make her lean on her father's advice. Don't intervene unless you understand the cost. But today, she already understood it. She had spent the last several months reviewing numbers that painted a picture she could no longer ignore. Rising complaint rates, dropping morale scores, feedback describing a culture shifting into something colder, harsher. Her board had chalked it up to growing pains. Her executives blamed staffing shortages. But Eleanor had seen this rot before in another company long ago. She knew how it spread. Quietly, invisibly, until one day it shouted like this man shouting at a woman old enough to be his mother. She stepped into the agent's line of sight with a calm steadiness that startled him. "Sir," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "She's complying. You need to lower your tone." His eyes snapped to hers, a flicker of confusion. She looked like no one of consequence, a woman traveling alone, a backpack instead of a briefcase, no entourage, no corporate armor, the type of traveler staff often assumed they could push past without consequence. "Ma'am," the agent replied, trying to recover. "This is a security matter. I suggest you stay back." Eleanor didn't move. "And I suggest you follow your de-escalation protocol. Section 7, Clause 4. His jaw slackened a fraction. Not many passengers quoted federal protocol with that kind of precision. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off with a quiet command. "Call your supervisor. I'll wait." Her tone was soft enough not to provoke, but sharpened by an authority he couldn't place. He hesitated, then stepped aside, signaling over a senior officer. The crowd exhaled, as though someone had released pressure from the room. The elderly woman looked at Eleanor with a fragile gratitude that pierced deeper than she expected. "Thank you," she whispered. Eleanor nodded, once, then lifted her bag and moved on through security, while the startled agent mumbled an apology he didn't know how to mean. As she walked toward Gate C-22, her pulse steadied. This was why she was here. Not to fly, to see, to feel the temperature of her airline from the ground up. For years, she had been shielded from this view by layers of executives who filtered the truth through polished reports and hopeful projections. She no longer trusted any of it. Not after the whistleblower reports. Not after the quiet resignations of the employees who had once called her father's company a family. Her father, Walter Grant, the man who built AmeriSky Airlines from 2 leased turboprops and a warehouse office. A man who had believed dignity was the currency of aviation. A man who taught her that a company does not crumble from a single failure, but from the 1,000 small ones no one bothers to correct. At the gate, Eleanor took a seat in the far corner. She blended easily into the late afternoon crowd, families juggling snacks and backpacks, business travelers typing with that frantic rhythm that signaled a missed deadline, seniors leaning carefully on armrests as they sat down. A murmur of airport life buzzed around her, the scent of pretzels, the distant rumble of a rolling suitcase, the low hum of CNN playing on a mounted screen. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, and yet there was a tension beneath it, like an orchestra quietly tuning before the conductor lifts the baton. She pulled out her boarding pass coach middle seat and tucked it into her jacket. For someone who could summon a private jet with a single phone call, the simplicity of this ticket felt grounding, necessary. It reminded her why she had chosen this method of investigation instead of the comfortable distance of a formal audit. Numbers could lie, but people rarely did when they thought no one was watching. Her gaze drifted to the AmeriSky crew assembling at the gate. A young flight attendant, barely in her 20s, stood stiffly as an older colleague corrected her hand placement on the announcement binder. "You're not listening, Jenna," the older one's snapped voice low but edged with irritation. "If you make mistakes on a full flight, you'll get written up again." Jenna swallowed hard, nodding. Her cheeks flushed. The older attendant, a woman named Grace Malloy, according to her badge, rubbed her temples with a kind of exhausted impatience. She didn't notice Eleanor watching. She didn't notice much at all. Her shoulders were hunched, her gestures sharp. A woman under pressure. A woman stretched thin. A woman who did not remember kindness as part of the job. Eleanor studied her with a level gaze. Grace was not a villain. Not yet. But she was a symptom. Then from the end of the gate, a man approached in a rumpled grey suit, breathing hard frustration, dripping from each step. Henry Mitchell, Senior Ground Operations. He had worked for AmeriSky for more than 30 years, long enough to know Walter Grant personally. He glanced around the gate, scanning faces, until his eyes landed on Eleanor. He paused. His brow tightened. Recognition flickered, tentative, uncertain. He had known her when she was younger, before she stepped into her father's legacy, before she withdrew from the public eye, before grief had carved deeper lines into her face. He started toward her, then hesitated, stopping mid-step. Something in her expression made him reconsider. She raised one steady finger to her lips. Not yet. Henry's chest rose with a heavy breath as he nodded. He understood. This wasn't the time. He turned away, composing himself, before stepping into a conversation with a gate agent who looked moments from tears. Eleanor watched him go, her thoughts tightening around a truth she had tried to ignore. People were hurting here. Cracks were widening, and what she had just witnessed wasn't an isolated flaw. It was a harbinger. Her flight would board soon, and once she stepped onto that aircraft, she would no longer be observing from afar. She would be entering the bloodstream of the very company she was trying to save, a company slipping faster than anyone realized, a company running out of time. And though no one here knew it, AmeriSky's reckoning had already begun. Boarding Group 3 was called, and the crowd surged forward with the restless shuffle of people resigned to cramped seats and limited patience. Eleanor rose with them, letting the motion carry her into the line as if she were just another traveler counting the minutes until arrival. But inside, every sense sharpened. This was the moment her father had always said revealed the truth of an airline, the way people behaved when they believed no one important was watching. The jet bridge exhaled a cool draft as she stepped onto it. Ahead, a man in his 60s muttered under his breath while wrestling a too large roller bag, his wife soothing him in whispers. Behind Eleanor, a teenager tapped the boarding pass app on his phone with brittle annoyance. The air was thick with impatience, the kind that didn't start here, but traveled with everyone from whatever they carried in their lives outside this hollow metal tunnel. At the aircraft door, Grace Malloy stood braced against the frame, like someone preparing for impact. Her smile was a taut line, her eyes dull with fatigue. "Welcome aboard," she said, the words automatic, stripped of their warmth. When Eleanor reached her, something flickered recognition of the earlier moment at the gate, perhaps, or just the instinctive reaction people had when they sensed someone they couldn't neatly categorize. But it vanished quickly as Grace turned her attention to a young man who pushed past without acknowledging her. Eleanor stepped into the aisle. The cabin buzzed with the uneasy choreography of passengers avoiding eye contact while silently claiming territory. A mother tried coaxing a toddler into a car seat. A businessman barked into his phone, promising someone he'd send a revised draft within the hour. An elderly veteran with a neatly pressed cap sat patiently waiting for the aisle to clear his hands, folded the way men fold their hands when they've lived through storms they never talk about. She reached her row coach middle seat and eased in with practiced grace. The window passenger, a thin woman with soft grey curls, gave her a polite nod. "Travelling home or heading out?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, carrying a faint Midwestern cadence. "Heading out," Eleanor replied. "You visiting my daughter?" "She just had her second baby." The woman smiled, then lowered her voice as a man heavily dropped into the aisle seat beside them. "Lord help me, I hope he's not a talker." He was. Within minutes he began narrating his business troubles into the phone, every word too loud for the confined space. Eleanor caught the window woman's helpless glance and offered a sympathetic tilt of her head. Small frustrations, small cruelties. They formed the true weather of a journey. The overhead bins slammed shut with the finality of a judge's gavel. Grace's voice floated through the speakers, crisp but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats as we complete our final checks." Her tone carried something brittle beneath the professionalism, something worn thin by repetition without reward. As the crew prepared the cabin, a commotion stirred near the front. A man in his 40s stood blocking the aisle, arguing with a flight attendant. His voice was hushed, but heated, the kind of anger people use when they don't want the world to know they're losing control. "I requested an aisle seat," he insisted. "You confirmed it yesterday." The younger attendant, a man still new enough to look hopeful, tried explaining the aircraft switch that had altered seating assignments. "Sir, I understand. But with the new configuration—" "I don't care about your configuration," the man spat. "Fix it." Passengers leaned, listened, pretended not to stare. Eleanor watched Grace approach, shoulders pulled tight, jaw set. She murmured something to the attendant, then took over the conversation. Her tone was firmer, sharper, but not unkind. She steered the man to a different row, found a swap restored order. But Eleanor saw the moment after the tiny sigh Grace hid as she stepped back behind the curtain, the trembling fingers smoothing the front of her uniform. Stress radiated from her like heat from asphalt. There was more here than overwork. Something deeper. Something she didn't dare say aloud. The engines hummed to life. The aircraft shuddered forward. Eleanor felt the familiar flutter in her stomach, the one that came, not from fear of flying, but from anticipation of what this flight would reveal. The man in the aisle seat resumed his loud conversation during taxi. The window woman pressed her fingers lightly to her forehead. Eleanor lifted her eyes and caught Grace passing by, assessing the noise with a weary glance. Grace paused, leaned toward the man, and reminded him gently that calls must end before takeoff. He waved her off without a word. Grace stiffened, then moved on. The aircraft lifted into the sky with a smooth ascent, the land below shrinking into neat patterns of snow-dusted grids. Eleanor let her gaze drift over the clouds, even as her mind tightened around the scenes she had gathered already, the frayed tensions, the suppressed frustrations, the lack of margin for error. Not one thing was catastrophic, but together they formed a lattice of slow unraveling. When beverage service began, the young attendant reached their row. He smiled at the window woman with genuine warmth, asked how her daughter was, asked if she needed extra napkins. When he turned to Eleanor, his expression stayed polite, but shortened, the smile dimming. And by the time he addressed the man in the aisle seat, his tone had retreated so far inward, it barely reached the outer shell of professionalism. The small imbalances in how people gave respect, how they received it. Eleanor had built an entire career understanding these patterns. Most leaders never learned to see them. She had no choice. She asked for water. The attendant nodded quickly and moved on. Minutes later, he returned with 2 cups, one full, one half full, set them down in the wrong order, apologized, corrected himself. His hands trembled just slightly. Stress, fatigue, overextension, and fear. Yes, there was fear in him too. Halfway through the flight, turbulence rattled the cabin. Nothing alarming, but enough to make conversations pause and knuckles whiten. Grace made her aisle pass, steadying herself with a hand on the seatbacks. When she reached Eleanor's row, she slowed her gaze, flicking over the passengers with a guarded awareness. It was the kind of look worn by someone who had spent too many months waiting for something to go wrong, because lately things always did. But then something happened. Something small but powerful. A teenage girl across the aisle began crying quietly. Her face was turned toward the window, shoulder hunched, trying to hide the trembling. Passengers glanced, then looked away. It wasn't their business. It never was. Grace stopped, really stopped. She knelt, slightly softened her voice. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" The girl wiped her cheek and shook her head, barely able to speak through her breathless hiccups. "I'm scared of flying," she whispered. "And my dad was supposed to be here. He missed the flight." Grace nodded slowly, compassion settling over her features like a memory of who she once was. "You're not alone. I'm right here, okay? I'll check on you through the flight." The girl nodded. The crying eased. Grace gave her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder and moved on. Eleanor watched this small miracle of humanity unfold, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not victory, but recognition. The frontline workers weren't the villains. They were the canaries in the mine, the symptoms of a deeper illness that leadership had refused to diagnose. Henry Mitchell had been right to hesitate earlier. The company wasn't broken because of one rude attendant or one stressed crew member. The system itself was fraying thread by thread. A voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We've just been notified of operational changes that may affect our arrival time into Boston. We'll update you as we receive more information." Eleanor closed her eyes. Operational changes. She had heard that phrase before. It rarely meant something simple. The reckoning she came to witness was beginning sooner than expected, and not from the direction anyone assumed. The announcement hit the cabin like a cold draft creeping under a closed door. Conversations dimmed, eyes lifted. People waited for the part no one wanted to hear. Eleanor felt the shift instantly, the tension thickening, the silence stretching too long before Captain Reynolds spoke again. "Folks, we've been advised we may need to divert due to a ground systems issue in Boston. Air traffic control will confirm shortly. A diversion. Not catastrophic, but never simple. Especially not on a flight already balancing on the edge of frayed nerves." Eleanor opened her eyes and watched the reactions ripple through the rows. The businessman in the aisle seat muttered a string of irritations under his breath, the kind spoken by men who believed fate should never inconvenience them. The elderly window woman quietly clasped her hands as if in prayer. Across the aisle, the teenage girl resumed sniffling, panic tightening her small shoulders. And from the galley curtain, Grace Malloy emerged with the look of someone bracing for another blow she didn't have the strength to absorb. The plane rocked gently, barely turbulence yet, enough to make the aisles feel narrower, the air heavier. Grace forced a smile toward her section, but it wobbled at the edges. When she reached the row ahead of Eleanor's, a man asked, "What's going on? Are we in danger?" "No, sir," she answered, voice softer now. "Everything is safe. We just may be landing somewhere else." She didn't say we don't know where yet. She didn't say the crew hadn't been briefed. She didn't say her gut told her. The instability she'd sensed brewing within AmeriSky for months was now rolling toward a breaking point. When she turned toward Eleanor's row, the loud businessman pounced. "Unbelievable," he barked. "I have a meeting at 5. This airline keeps getting worse. Last month we sat on the tarmac for an hour. Now this. Do you people ever get anything right?" His voice wasn't just annoyance. It was attack, the kind that sought targets, not solutions. Grace inhaled, slowly preparing herself, but Eleanor spoke first. "Sir," she said evenly, "she can't change the weather or the FAA ground orders." The man whipped his head toward her. "I wasn't talking to you." His tone cracked like dry wood snapping under pressure, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She'd stood before congressional committees. She'd faced investors hungry for blood. She had weathered storms far more dangerous than one man's entitlement. "I understand," she replied, calm as winter lake water. "But you're speaking to someone who's only doing her job. The situation isn't her fault." Grace blinked, surprised by the defense. The man scoffed. "You have no idea what this costs me." Maybe he meant money. Maybe pride. Maybe the illusion that he controlled anything in his life. Eleanor saw the fear disguised as anger. She'd seen it in boardrooms and funerals and war rooms of corporate disasters. People didn't lash out because they were strong. They lashed out because they were breaking. Grace placed a hand on the seat back, steadying herself. "Sir, I'll make announcements as soon as we know more," she said. Her tone was steady, now anchored by something Eleanor couldn't name. Grace continued down the aisle, but not before flashing Eleanor the faintest nod, a silent thank you between two strangers, bound by the thin thread of decency in a crowded metal tube. The loud man leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, grumbling to himself. Eleanor didn't look at him. Instead, she watched the cabin crew exchanging tense glances. Something was off. Not just the diversion threat. Something deeper. She noticed Jenna, the young attendant, standing by the galley curtain, twisting her hands. She dropped a packet of pretzels, stooped to pick it up, then froze as a passenger accidentally bumped her shoulder. She jumped as if struck. Fear. Not of turbulence, of repercussions. Eleanor adjusted in her seat, observing like a surgeon studying symptoms. Suddenly the intercom clicked again. "This is Captain Reynolds. Air Traffic Control has requested updated information from our airline's operations center before confirming our landing clearance." Passengers groaned, but Eleanor leaned forward. That phrasing was unusual. ATC rarely asked for an airline's internal operations data mid-flight unless there was a problem with the airline, not the airport. She felt her pulse tick upward. Something was unraveling somewhere on the ground, and she had a terrible suspicion about exactly where. A soft thud pulled her attention to the aisle. The teenage girl's water bottle had rolled out from under her seat. Jenna hurried to pick it up, forcing a smile. "Here you go, honey." "Thanks," the girl whispered. Jenna hesitated, then knelt slightly. "Are you doing okay?" she asked gently. The girl shook her head, tears gathering. "My dad was supposed to fly with me. He didn't make it past security. They stopped him. Said they needed more screening. They treated him like." Her voice cracked. Jenna swallowed. "I'm so sorry. That shouldn't happen." She meant it. Eleanor saw the sincerity soften the edges of her posture. But then Grace appeared in the aisle and pulled Jenna aside with quiet urgency. Their voices were low, but the tension in Grace's face was unmistakable. "What did you tell her?" Grace whispered sharply. "I just said I was sorry about her dad getting screened," Jenna stammered. Grace closed her eyes briefly, pain flickering across her brow. "Jenna, we cannot comment on TSA decisions. You know this. Do you want ops to flag you again? You're already on thin ice after last month. Please be careful." Jenna's eyes watered. "I wasn't thinking. She was crying." Grace's voice softened. "I know. But this company is watching everything we say lately. Just protect yourself." They parted, each carrying a different weight. Jenna walked away looking smaller. Grace looked older. Eleanor felt the threads tightening. Fear, exhaustion, distrust. A workforce stretched to breaking, and a leadership team too far removed to feel the tremors. Except she wasn't removed. Not today. Not anymore. The intercom clicked once more. Captain Reynolds again. His voice lower, now more careful. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed there is a systems issue within our airline's operations center, affecting multiple flights. We are holding at altitude until we receive clearance." That was the confirmation Eleanor needed. Internal systems issue, affecting multiple flights, and ops requiring confirmation for landing. This wasn't about weather. AmeriSky was malfunctioning under the surface. The cabin buzzed with anxious whispers. The businessman in the aisle cursed. The window woman clutched her cross necklace. The teenage girl cried again. But Eleanor sat very still, because somewhere on the ground, someone in AmeriSky's operations was likely making decisions without understanding that the woman sitting quietly in coach coat, folded hands, still eyes sharp, was the one person who could dismantle or save this airline with a single phone call. Not yet. Not until she had seen enough. She inhaled deeply. The recycled cabin air tasted metallic, tired. Then, for the first time since boarding, she felt a flicker of anticipation. A diversion meant delays. Delays meant pressure. Pressure revealed truth, and on this flight, truth was already clawing its way to the surface. Eleanor folded her hands. The reckoning wasn't coming. It was already here. The plane had been in holding for nearly 20 minutes when the cabin lights flickered twice, just enough for passengers to look up startled before the glow steadied again. A murmur rippled through the rows. People sensed instability long before they understood it. Eleanor felt it too, a subtle vibration threading through the metal frame, a tension heavier than turbulence. Something in the air had shifted. From the galley curtain, Captain Reynolds emerged, walking down the aisle with a gravity that quieted conversations as he passed. It was rare for a captain to leave the cockpit mid-flight unless circumstances forced it. His eyes scanned faces, measuring calm, reading fear. He stopped near row 12 to speak quietly with Grace. She nodded, her expression tightening, then disappeared behind the curtain. Eleanor watched the exchange closely. Reynolds continued toward the back, moving with the deliberate steps of a man absorbing more than he intended to share. When he reached Eleanor's row, he paused to let a flight attendant pass. His eyes flicked toward her boarding pass, sticking out from her jacket pocket, then up to her face. For a moment, he seemed to study her with faint recognition, not of her identity, but of her composure. People who remained still when things shook always caught his attention. He moved on, and Eleanor felt her pulse settle into a slow, steady beat. Something was unraveling beneath the surface. She needed to understand how deep it went. The man in the aisle seat groaned loudly. They can't keep us circling forever. Are they incompetent? Or just reckless? His words spilled into the cramped space, sharp as broken glass. The window woman whispered a quiet prayer. Eleanor pressed her palms together, thinking. The intercom finally buzzed with an announcement from Grace. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin limited beverage service for your comfort while we await updated instructions. Her voice wavered slightly, a tiny fracture beneath the polished cadence. When the cart approached, Grace carried herself with stern focus, but Jenna trailed behind her steps, small and hesitant. They reached Eleanor's row. The aisle man demanded bourbon before Grace could even greet them. Jenna reached for the cup, but her hand shook, and she knocked a can sideways. It clattered loudly on the tray, drawing the attention of several rows. The man sneered. Great. First you delay the plane, now you can't even serve a drink. Jenna's face flushed crimson. Grace stepped forward, shielding her. Sir, I will assist you, she said evenly. But her jaw clenched. A battlefield that was never supposed to exist had formed between the crew and passengers, and Eleanor could see the toll in every line of Grace's face. The aisle man grumbled his order again. Grace handed him the drink with professional restraint, though her eyes flashed with something darker, resentment, exhaustion, maybe even fear of consequences unknown to passengers. Eleanor turned her attention toward the galley. A faint argument drifted from behind the curtain, not loud enough to make out the words, but sharp enough to cut through the hum of engines. Two voices, one male, one female. The male voice, steady but strained, belonged to Captain Reynolds. The female voice, Grace. She's not stable today, Grace's voice hissed. You saw her. She'll buckle if this gets worse. Captain Reynolds spoke quietly, too low to catch. Grace's reply was louder. We are down a crew member because corporate froze hiring. We're short-staffed, overworked, and Ops isn't telling us anything. This isn't safe. Safe. A word with weight. Eleanor leaned back, absorbing the conversation, with eyes half closed, as if resting. She wasn't. She was cataloguing every detail. The curtain parted abruptly, and Jenna stepped out, wiping her eyes. She almost bumped into Eleanor's armrest as she passed. She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Excuse me." Eleanor looked up, her voice low and even. "You're doing fine." Jenna blinked, startled. Her voice trembled. "It's my 3rd week flying. I wasn't supposed to work this route. Someone called out this morning. They're watching me because I made mistakes last week." She rubbed her fingers anxiously along the edge of the seat back. "I'm trying, but it's like nothing we were trained for matches what's happening up here." Eleanor's gaze softened, though her words remained measured. "Training works when leadership works. When it doesn't, everything else breaks." Jenna hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but Grace stepped out of the galley with sharp urgency in her eyes. "Jenna," she called, "I need you. Now." Jenna straightened instantly, slipping back into duty mode before rushing to join her. As they disappeared into the galley, the curtain swayed slightly, the faintest glimpse of Captain Reynolds inside, consulting a paper manifest, with a frown etched deep across his face. Something was wrong with more than the operations center. Then a metallic chime cut through the cabin. Inbox. Overhead speakers. A system message from ground ops. Grace's voice returned. "Captain Reynolds, please contact Operations Center immediately." Not normal. Not at all. The captain re-emerged from the galley and walked briskly toward the cockpit. Before closing the door, he addressed the attendants with low, urgent orders. Grace nodded, though fear flickered across her expression. And then the door clicked shut. The cabin sat in a fragile hush. Eleanor felt her heart beat slow with a clarity she had not felt in years. Whatever crisis had begun on the ground was escalating mid-air, and AmeriSky's operations center, the nerve system of the entire airline, was calling the captain directly in flight. That alone meant a threat larger than a divert or a delay. The businessman beside her wasn't done complaining. "They better compensate us for this disaster," he muttered. "This airline used to mean something." Eleanor's gaze sharpened her voice, quiet, but edged with truth. "It still does. But people forget what things stand for when pressure rises." He rolled his eyes. "Well, whoever's running it now doesn't know what they're doing." Eleanor didn't answer, but her silence was weighted. The plane jolted suddenly, just enough to jostle cups and elicit startled gasps. Grace reappeared immediately, her voice firm as she called over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Flight crew, take positions. Emergency procedure cadence, though softened." Eleanor steadied herself. A diversion was no longer just a possibility, it was becoming imminent. Then, like the final stroke of a conductor preparing an orchestra for a storm, Captain Reynolds's voice filled the cabin. "Folks, we've received updated instructions. Our airline's operations center has declared a priority systems alert affecting multiple aircraft. We will be diverting. Stand by for details." Passengers erupted into confusion, but Eleanor didn't react. She had expected this. What she didn't expect was what happened next. Henry Mitchell's name flashed across her phone screen. He had never once called her directly in 30 years. She answered quietly. Mum, Henry whispered, voice strained. "I don't know how to say this, but someone inside AmeriSky just shut down our dispatch system. They're calling it an internal sabotage." Eleanor's heart thudded once sharply. Henry continued breathing hard, and whoever did it left a message. What message, Eleanor asked calmly. Henry swallowed. They said the company needs to answer for what it's become. The line went quiet. The plane hummed on, suspended between cities, between crises, between truths long ignored. And Eleanor Grant understood something with chilling certainty. This was no longer a flight delay. It was the beginning of a war inside her own airline. The cabin had settled into an uneasy silence when the captain's latest announcement faded, but inside that hush lived 1,000 private storms. Passengers stared ahead, knuckles tight against armrests, minds racing through worst-case scenarios they would never voice aloud. Eleanor felt the shift in the atmosphere, the way one senses a storm before it breaks pressure. Building breath, tightening threads, snapping one by one. The aisle lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft banked left into a new heading. Grace and Jenna braced themselves instinctively, fingers gripping seat backs. The businessman beside Eleanor muttered curses about missed meetings. The elderly woman by the window murmured another soft prayer. And the teenage girl across the aisle pulled her knees into her chest, rocking gently, trying to steady the tremble in her breath. Eleanor remained still. Her pulse was steady, but her thoughts moved fast, methodical, slicing through chaos with the precision she'd inherited from her father. Internal sabotage, dispatch offline, a message demanding accountability. None of it made sense yet. All of it did. Systems didn't collapse from a single bad decision. They fractured after years of slow decay when the wrong people were empowered and the right voices ignored. A sudden clang erupted from the galley, sharp and metallic. Jenna let out a startled yelp as a tray slipped from her hands and crashed onto the floor. Cans rolled into the aisle like scattered coins. The businessman flinched, glaring. "For God's sake, control yourselves!" Jenna crouched quickly, scrambling to gather everything. Her cheeks burned with shame. Grace knelt beside her, jaw tight, and took over with quick, steady hands. "I'll finish this." "Go help in the back," she whispered. Jenna hesitated. "Grace, I go." Grace repeated, more urgent now. Jenna rose and hurried down the aisle, nearly tripping over a bag that jutted out from under a seat. Grace stayed crouched, collecting cans with a slow exhale that bordered on exhaustion more than frustration. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Rough day," she said, quietly. Grace looked up, startled. "You could say that." Her eyes were weary, threaded with something deeper, fear, resentment, and a grief she hadn't yet named. Eleanor held her gaze. "This isn't about the flight, is it?" Grace blinked, expression hardening. "Ma'am, with respect, I can't discuss internal matters. Because Ops is watching everything," Eleanor's voice softened. "And because the crew feel like they're one mistake away from being replaced." Grace froze, staring at her as if trying to decide whether Eleanor was simply perceptive or dangerous. She closed her eyes briefly. "It's not my place to say," she replied. I don't know how much more some of us can take. We're short-staffed. Policies keep changing. People are scared." In the cockpit, a low chime echoed through the door, and Captain Reynolds's voice drifted faintly as he coordinated with air traffic control. The tension seeped like smoke through the cabin. Grace rose, slowly smoothing the front of her uniform. "We're doing our best," she said, though her voice cracked just slightly. She stepped away before Eleanor could answer. Across the aisle, a young man in a college sweatshirt tapped his foot anxiously. "Do we even have enough fuel for a diversion?" he asked aloud, directing the question to no one in particular. The businessman scoffed. "If they don't, this whole airline should be shut down." Eleanor cut him a sharp look. "The flight crew know what they're doing. Her tone carried weight, enough to make him flinch back in silence. The turbulence returned, not violent, but persistent, like a hand shaking the plane from below. The cabin rattled. The overhead bins trembled. The teenage girl began crying again. Jenna approached her before anyone else could. She knelt, lowering herself to eye level. "Hey, breathe with me," she whispered. In slow, out slow. "You're okay." The girl tried, but her sobs quickened. "My dad's probably still stuck at the airport. What if something happens? What if..." Jenna shook her head softly. "Nothing's going to happen to him. And nothing's going to happen to you. You're safe right now." "How do you know?" the girl whispered. Jenna paused, her voice lowered into something fragile, but honest. "Because I'm scared too. And when people are scared together, they hold each other up. That's how we get through things." The girl blinked, startled by the vulnerability, and nodded slowly. Her breathing eased. Jenna offered her a tentative smile before rising and moving down the aisle to assist elsewhere. Grace watched from the galley curtain, her expression shifting through a storm of emotions: pride, worry, bitterness, hope. She caught Eleanor observing and quickly looked away. Another announcement buzzed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be diverting to Cleveland Hopkins International. Estimated landing in approximately 30 minutes. Cleveland. Not ideal, but safe." Passengers reacted instantly. Complaints, groans, whispered worries. Eleanor listened to every voice, every tremor, every crack forming in the collective calm. The businessman beside her slammed his palm against the armrest. "Cleveland, are you kidding me? She didn't even turn. There are worse places to land." "Not when you have a meeting worth 7 figures, he snapped. Eleanor's jaw tightened, though her expression remained composed. "Money doesn't outrank safety," she replied. "Not in the air." He scoffed. "Easy to say when you don't have anything at stake." Her eyes flicked toward him, dark, sharp, almost cutting. "You have no idea what I have at stake." He faltered, confused. Something in her tone unsettled him. The engines shifted pitch. The aircraft began its descent, angling toward a break in the clouds. As they dropped lower, the world outside came into view. Cleveland's winter landscape stretched in grey and white beneath a dull sun. Then Eleanor's phone buzzed again in her jacket pocket. A message from Henry. We found the source. Eleanor exhaled slowly, shoulders tightening. Another message appeared. "It's someone inside flight operations. A third. And Mom, they're on shift right now." She didn't move, didn't blink, just listened to the hum of the engines and the rising panic around her. Because this meant something far worse than a system outage. Someone inside her company, inside her father's company, was dismantling it from within. The plane dipped lower, Cleveland's runways rising towards them. Eleanor clasped her hands, her face composed, her breath steady. She was ready for a fight. But the airline wasn't. And neither were the people who had no idea that the woman sitting quietly in coach traveling under a different name was the one person capable of exposing everything. The metal beneath her feet vibrated as the aircraft prepared to land. A reckoning waited on the ground, and Eleanor Grant had just begun to walk toward it. The wheels touched the runway with a hard, jarring thud, harder than usual. Not unsafe but decisive, like Captain Reynolds had chosen firmness over finesse. The cabin jolted as reverse thrusters roared, rattling nerves already stretched thin. A few passengers gasped. The teenager grabbed the armrest with white knuckles. The businessman muttered something into his chest that sounded like a curse. Eleanor stayed still, feeling the force press her back into the seat. A landing like that wasn't about conditions. It was about urgency. Reynolds wanted this aircraft on the ground, fast. As they slowed, the cabin filled with a tense silence, broken only by the tremor of metal and the rough sigh of brakes gripping concrete. Snow flurried across the windows, light swirling, almost delicate, contrasting sharply with the tension inside the plane. Cleveland's winter sky loomed in pale grey as the aircraft taxied toward an unfamiliar gate area. Before the usual chime clicked, Captain Reynolds spoke, his voice lower than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cleveland. Please remain seated as we await instructions. We appreciate your patience." He sounded tired and worried. That alone was enough to make Eleanor's pulse sharpen. Grace and Jenna took their jump seats, both facing forward, forced into stillness, while their eyes betrayed everything they felt: questions, fear, exhaustion, and the weight of responsibility heavier than any carry-on in the overhead bins. The businessman beside Eleanor sighed heavily. Cleveland? What a joke! He shook his head, sneering. Tech meltdown, incompetent staff, this whole airline is circling the drain. The elderly woman by the window flinched. Eleanor turned to the man, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. If this airline were circling the drain, you'd already know it, and you'd be grateful to be on the ground. He blinked, thrown by the authority in her tone. Before he could argue, the jet bridge thumped against the aircraft door too quickly. The ramp crew was rushing. That meant AmeriSky had already notified Cleveland this plane required priority handling. Grace unbuckled, stood, and made the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have been instructed to deplane in controlled groups." Controlled groups. Not passengers first. Not those needing assistance. Controlled groups meant security coordination. Meant operations involvement. Something was waiting for them outside. As Grace spoke, her voice trembled only once, so briefly almost no one noticed. But Eleanor did. Grace wasn't afraid of the passengers. She was afraid of something else. Something bigger. The jet bridge door opened. 2 airport personnel in reflective jackets stepped inside, followed by a third, an AmeriSky station lead, judging by the badge clipped to his coat. His eyes scanned the cabin quickly, urgently. Then his gaze landed on Eleanor's row. He stiffened. A flicker of recognition. Not full recognition Eleanor's alias still held, but awareness. As if someone had described her. Recently. With urgency. He stepped toward her with an authority that made passengers shift in their seats. When he reached her row, he leaned down slightly. Miss Blake Eleanor looked up, her expression composed. "Yes." "We've been asked to escort you off the aircraft first," passengers murmured. The businessman's eyebrows shot up. Eleanor kept her voice even. For what reason? The station lead hesitated. "AmeriSky Security needs to speak with you immediately. They said it's time-sensitive." Time-sensitive. Not optional. Not routine. Grace froze behind him, eyes widening as she realized what was happening. Jenna clutched the back of a seat, confusion flickering across her face. Eleanor rose, slowly smoothing her coat. As she stepped into the aisle, the businessman sputtered, "Why her? She's nobody." Grace shot him a cold look that shut him up instantly. Eleanor followed the station lead toward the exit. Her footsteps were soft but decisive. Every head turned as she passed, some curious, some concerned, some irritated by the disruption. But no one knew that the center of gravity in this unfolding crisis was quietly leaving row 17. At the aircraft door, Captain Reynolds stood waiting, his expression stern and unreadable. When Eleanor approached, he lowered his voice. "Ma'am, I don't know what's going on, but Ops flagged your name. He didn't know her real identity. Not yet. But he sensed weight the kind that didn't belong to an ordinary passenger. Thank you, Captain," she said softly. His brow furrowed. For what? For keeping the plane steady. Reynolds exhaled a trace of relief, softening his jaw. "Be careful, ma'am." She nodded, then stepped into the jet bridge. The moment the door closed behind her, the atmosphere changed. Two AmeriSky security officers waited midway down the bridge, not transportation security, but internal corporate security. Their posture was rigid, trained, alert. Behind them stood a third figure, Henry Mitchell. He looked pale, shaken breath, forming white clouds in the cold air, leaking through the seams of the bridge. When he saw her, his shoulders sagged in relief and fear at once. "Ma'am," Henry said quietly, "it's worse than we thought." Eleanor approached, eyes sharp. "Tell me." Henry swallowed hard. Ops traced the sabotage to someone with high-level clearance. Someone who knows your father's old systems. They didn't just shut down dispatch. They rerouted internal communications. Her pulse tightened. Who, she asked? Henry's voice was barely above a whisper. Someone inside Cleveland operations. Someone who requested your flight specifically. Eleanor's stomach sank, not with fear, but clarity. "Where are they now?" she asked. Henry glanced toward the end of the jet bridge, where a set of doors led to a restricted hallway. "The security team detained him minutes ago," Henry said. "But he's demanding to speak with you. Only you." Eleanor inhaled deeply the cold air, sharpening her senses. "Who is he?" she pressed. Henry's voice broke slightly. "Mark Talbot, ma'am." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Talbot, the systems engineer." Henry nodded. "Your father hired him 20 years ago. They said he claims he's trying to protect the company. He said AmeriSky is dying from the inside, and no one will listen unless he forces the truth into the open." Eleanor felt the world tighten around one single fact. Talbot wasn't a saboteur. He was a loyalist, pushed too far. She straightened her shoulders. "Take me to him." Henry exhaled with a tremor. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor walked down the restricted hallway, with unhurried steps flanked by security officers. Her face unreadable, her posture calm. But beneath that calm, something fierce awakened. Someone inside AmeriSky had finally said aloud what she had known for months. And now, in a locked room in Cleveland, the man who broke the system was waiting for her. Not to destroy the airline, but to make her choose its future. The hallway narrowed as they approached the secured conference room, one of those windowless, sound-dampened spaces built not for comfort, but for containment. The fluorescent lights flickered with a faint hum, echoing the tension in the air. Two AmeriSky security officers flanked the door, their hands resting near their belts, not threatening, but prepared. When they saw Eleanor, they straightened as if sensing an authority they didn't yet understand. Henry paused before opening the door. His breath shivered in the cold draft seeping from the jet bridge seams. "Ma'am, before we go in, you should know something else." Eleanor held his gaze. "Say it." Henry's voice grew fragile, like a man forced to confront a truth he'd hoped was wrong. "Talbot says he didn't act alone." A thin silence settled sharp as frost. Eleanor's eyes darkened, not with surprise, but recognition. "How many he wouldn't give a number," Henry whispered. "Just that their everywhere leadership stopped listening." Eleanor inhaled slowly the cold air, slicing through her composure, but not breaking it. "Open the door, Henry." He did. inside the room felt too small for the storm it held. Mark Talbot sat alone at the metal conference table, hands folded, posture perfectly still, as if stillness were the last thing he could control. He looked older than Eleanor remembered, grey hair disordered, glasses tilted slightly. His uniform jacket rumpled, the badge clipped crookedly, as if he'd put it back on after being forced out of it. But his eyes, those sharp, brilliant eyes her father once praised, as the eyes of a man who sees the holes before the hull breaks, hadn't dulled at all. The moment Eleanor stepped in, Mark rose. Eleanor Grant. His voice cracked, part awe, part fury, part something quieter, something like grief. You finally came down from the clouds. Henry shifted uncomfortably. The guards tensed. Eleanor didn't. She moved forward, one step, shoulders squared, breath even. "Why am I here, Mark?" He let out a bitter laugh, the kind that held years of disappointment. "Because they wouldn't let me talk to your executives. They wouldn't let me talk to corporate. And they sure as hell wouldn't let me talk to the board." His jaw clenched. "But you're the only one left who still has your father's ear, even if he's been gone for years." Eleanor studied him. Sabotaging dispatch put hundreds of passengers at risk. "I didn't sabotage it." He shot back, eyes blazing. "I exposed it." The guards moved, but Eleanor raised a hand to stop them. "Explain." Mark leaned forward, his fingers trembling. The system failures weren't accidents. They weren't glitches. They were cover-ups. He swallowed hard. Maintenance outsourcing, unreported mechanical delays, crew fatigue violations, records disappearing. His voice cracked with raw anger. "Your father built this airline on dignity. They're selling it for scrap." Eleanor's heart tightened, but not from surprise. She had suspected mismanagement, erosion of morale, incompetent leadership. But this level of internal collapse, it was worse. Much worse. Still, she kept her voice calm. "Why bring down dispatch? To force you to look," he said. "To make the board listen. To make someone, anyone, acknowledge what's happening before a plane goes down." Henry closed his eyes, pained by the truth threaded through every word. Eleanor approached the table until she was standing across from Mark, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his mouth, the tremble beneath his stillness. "Why now?" she asked. "Why this flight?" Mark hesitated only a moment, then lifted his gaze to meet hers. "Because of her," he said softly. "Grace Malloy." The name landed like a stone in a quiet pool. Eleanor frowned slightly. The lead attendant, Mark, nodded, voice thickening. Grace filed complaints, honest ones, detailed ones, about understaffing, about rushed inspections, about being forced to fly overtime without rest. She tried to go through the proper channels. They retaliated, put her on corrective watch, flagged her file. His jaw tightened. "She's one of the best crew we have left. And they're breaking her." Eleanor absorbed this, her face, still her spine, rigid. "Grace isn't the only one," Mark continued. "My team, we saw the stress fracturing the entire system. And when operations ignored our reports, we realized something." He leaned closer. The airline wasn't failing from the bottom. It was collapsing from the top. The words struck Henry like a punch. He lowered his head. Eleanor's breath moved, slow, deliberate. "So you grounded my flight to make me see Mark," shook his head. "No. I grounded your flight because I knew you were watching." His voice steadied. "And because your father trusted me. He told me once, if you ever see the soul of this company slipping away, you fight like hell to pull it back." Eleanor's throat tightened, a rare, fleeting crack in the armor. Walter Grant had said those exact words to her when she was 20, the night before she left for business school. She forced her voice steady. And your network, the people helping you, Mark, hesitated again. They're not saboteurs. They're loyalists. People who remember what AmeriSky was before the suits took over. Before bottom lines outranked human lives. Eleanor felt the truth anchor deep. Mark leaned back, defeated but defiant. I know they'll fire me. Maybe charge me. I don't care. His voice lowered to a trembling whisper. I just needed you to see what's happening, before something catastrophic does. Silence stretched, heavy, echoing. Finally, Eleanor stepped toward the guards. Uncuff him, she said. They looked at each other startled. Ma'am, he's been— Uncuff him, she repeated. Her voice left no room for hesitation. The metal clicked open. Mark winced as he flexed his wrists. Eleanor turned back to him. You're not my enemy, she said quietly. But you've put me in a position where I have to decide whether to bury you or let you help me save my father's company. Mark's breath hitched unsure, disbelieving. Eleanor continued, each word sharp as steel. If what you're saying is true, then the rot goes deeper than either of us imagined. And I need evidence. All of it. Mark nodded slowly, hope flickering through exhaustion. I can show you everything. Eleanor stepped back, the air around her, suddenly colder, heavier, electrified by purpose. Then let's begin, she said. Behind her, Henry released a trembling breath of relief and dread. In the hallway outside, the officers exchanged looks, confused, uneasy, unable to reconcile the quiet woman in a traveler's coat with the authority she carried like a weapon. They didn't know who she really was. Not yet. And when they learned, it would change everything. Eleanor Grant turned toward the exit. A war had begun inside AmeriSky, and she was done watching from the sidelines. The moment Eleanor stepped back into the hallway, the air felt different, denser, charged, humming with the invisible energy of a crisis, trying to stay contained. A corporate security supervisor waited near the door, speaking hurriedly into a radio voice, tight. When he saw her, he straightened immediately posture, shifting from procedural to deferential, without knowing why. Authority recognized authority even when it couldn't name it. Henry walked beside her, wringing his hands in a way she'd never seen during his decades of quiet competence. Ma'am, you understand what this means, he said softly as they moved down the corridor. Talbot isn't lying. The documents he showed us there are patterns, gaps, red flags. But we don't know how high this goes. Eleanor kept her eyes forward. We will. They turned into a small operations briefing room where a handful of Cleveland Station leads 2 security managers and a flight operations controller were waiting. Conversations halted as she entered, because even under an alias, she walked like someone used to, standing at the head of the table. The controller, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard and a badge that read Aaron Hensley, cleared his throat nervously. Ms. Blake, thank you for coming. We're working with limited information from headquarters. His wording hit her immediately. Limited information. From HQ. That was worse than no information. Tell me what you know, Eleanor said. He gestured to a wall screen filled with blinking alerts and aircraft icons scattered across the Midwest. Dispatch is partially offline. Some flights have been rerouted manually. Others are stuck waiting for clearance. We're maintaining safety, but operations is fractured, and every attempt we make to reach Central Command is routed through different messaging channels. Different, Eleanor repeated. As in inconsistent, Aaron hesitated, as in intentionally inconsistent. A murmur moved through the room. Henry stepped closer. "How long have the inconsistencies been happening?" Aaron rubbed the back of his neck. "It started a few weeks ago. Small things at first. Dispatch logs not matching crew reports. Maintenance records closing out without confirmation. It looked like clerical errors, maybe system lag. But today," he gestured to the chaotic map. "Today it became impossible to hide." Eleanor scanned the screen. Colored lines zigzagged across states in ways that made no operational sense. Flights redirected without cause. Crew assignments overlapping. Routes duplicated. Someone was inside the system, not breaking it, bending it. The security supervisor finally spoke. "Ma'am, we've notified HQ that a passenger was removed for questioning. He cleared his throat, unsure. They didn't ask for details." Eleanor turned to him slowly. "They're not asking, or they're avoiding." His mouth opened, then closed. "I don't know." She did. She knew exactly what it meant. When leadership stayed silent during crisis, they were scrambling to protect themselves. Her phone buzzed again. A message from a number only 3 people in the company had access to. "CEO Bradley, where are you?" Not a question, a demand. Then a second message. "We need to talk." Eleanor felt a cold, focused clarity settle inside her. Bradley wasn't panicking because the airline was collapsing. He was panicking because she was somewhere inside the collapse. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Aaron. "Who at HQ has override access to the dispatch network?" Aaron's face went pale. "Only a few executives, Director of Operations, VP of Flight Safety," and he stopped. "And the CIO Eleanor finished." Aaron nodded. Henry swallowed hard. "Ma'am, you think someone inside corporate command is involved?" Eleanor didn't blink. "I think someone at the top ignored warning after warning until the people beneath them broke. And someone else has now decided to use that crack to force a reckoning." The room fell silent. No one disagreed. They didn't dare. Before anyone could speak, the door burst open. Grace Malloy stood there, breathing hard, still in uniform eyes, burning with something fierce and unbound. The guards moved instinctively, but she raised a shaking hand. "Please," she gasped. "I need to talk to Miss Blake." Eleanor stepped forward. "Grace." Grace's voice cracked. "Captain Reynolds asked me to come. Said someone in operations requested our flight manifest. Not standard, not protocol, not when we've already diverted." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Who requested it?" Grace shook her head. "They wouldn't say. But it wasn't from Cleveland Ops. It came from corporate." Henry's eyes widened. Aaron swore under his breath. Eleanor inhaled through her nose, slow and controlled. "What did they ask for?" "The seating chart," Grace whispered. "Specifically the passenger list for row 17. Henry turned to stare at Eleanor. "Row 17. That's where you—" Grace stopped, mid-sentence, confusion dawning on her face. "Wait, why would corporate need to know where you were sitting, Miss Blake? Who exactly are you?" Silence fell like a stone, dropped into deep water. Eleanor held Grace's gaze, steady and unflinching. This was the moment she had intended to delay, to observe before revealing, to gather truth before wielding power. But the truth was now rushing toward her, pulled by forces already in motion. She took one step closer. Her voice, low-controlled, threaded with something that made the entire room lean in without meaning to. "My real name," she said, "is Eleanor Grant." Grace blinked. Aaron's jaw dropped. Henry exhaled in relief, as if finally allowed to breathe. "I am the owner of AmeriSky Airlines." Grace staggered back a step, her face draining of color. The guards straightened, as if electricity had shot through their spines. Aaron's tablet slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. Inside the stunned stillness, Eleanor let the weight of her identity fill the room like a rising tide, quiet, unstoppable. And someone at corporate command, she continued, is trying to find me. Grace's voice trembled. Why, what do they want? Eleanor looked at her, not with fear, not with anger, but with an unwavering surgical clarity. To stop me, she said. Her phone buzzed again. CEO Bradley, do not speak to anyone. Wait where you are. She locked the phone without reading more. Grace swallowed. Miss Grant, what do we do now? Eleanor turned toward the operations map, the flashing warnings, the scattered flights, the unraveling web. Then she answered with a calm that cut through the tension like a blade. We take back my father's airline, she said, and we start by finding out why the man who runs it is afraid of me being here. The room froze. The war inside AmeriSky wasn't coming. It had fully begun. The room held its breath, suspended between shock and the gravity of what Eleanor had just revealed. Grace stood rooted to the floor, her hand still gripping the edge of the doorway, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Aaron Hensley looked like he was trying to calculate 1,000 variables at once, and failing. Even the security officer's men, trained to remain expressionless in chaos, shifted uneasily their eyes, flicking toward Eleanor with new awareness, new fear. Eleanor didn't flinch. The truth had a weight, yes, but she had learned long ago that it only crushed people who tried to outrun it. She faced it head-on. Ms. Grant. Grace whispered, voice trembling. If the CEO is trying to keep you contained, what does that mean for us? It means, Eleanor said, that we are already in the middle of something far larger than a malfunctioning dispatch system. Henry rubbed a hand over his face. Ma'am Bradley's messages, they sound like he's panicking. Of course he's panicking, she replied. He's losing control of a narrative he thought he owned. She moved toward the operations map on the wall. The blinking red alerts looked like wounds spreading across the surface of a body. Her father once said that an airline was a living organism. Every crew, every gate agent, every mechanic, every aircraft part of a single circulatory system. What she was seeing now wasn't a glitch. It was a system in cardiac arrest. Aaron swallowed hard. Ms. Grant, if corporate knows you're here, they'll issue instructions to keep you contained. They'll spin this. They'll protect the leadership chain. Leadership, Eleanor murmured. Is that what you call a chain that strangles information from the bottom up? Aaron's lips parted, but no words came out. Grace stepped forward, voice steadying through shock. Ms. Grant, is it true? What Talbot said about the pressure on crew, the retaliation, the cuts. Eleanor turned. Grace's eyes were bright with something sharper than fear betrayal. She had spent years giving everything to this airline, only to find out the people above her had treated her loyalty like scrap metal. Yes, Eleanor said quietly. It's true. Grace closed her eyes. A slow exhale left her chest like a release valve giving way under too much pressure. Before anyone could speak, Aaron's tablet lit up on the floor where it had fallen, vibrating violently. Alerts cascaded across the screen. Henry bent to pick it up. His face drained. Oh God, he whispered. Another system just went offline. Aaron rushed to him. Which one Henry showed him. Crew scheduling. Aaron's voice cracked. That's impossible. Scheduling is on a separate, secure server, was Henry corrected. Eleanor stepped closer. What does this affect? Aaron swallowed. Everything. Crew legality checks, rest requirements, pairing confirmations. If scheduling goes down, flights across the system are going to stall. Pilots can't fly if the legality system can't confirm their hours. Meaning, Henry added, voice trembling, this airline is minutes away from total operational collapse. A heavy silence fell. Grace braced herself against the table. Why would someone do this? Eleanor didn't hesitate. To force a truth into the open that leadership has buried for years. As the weight of her words settled, a voice crackled through Aaron's radio, urgent, disoriented. This is Dispatch Cleveland. We just received an override command from HQ. They're grounding all AmeriSky flights within the hour. I repeat, the entire fleet is. They're grounding the entire fleet, Grace gasped. Henry cursed under his breath. The guards exchanged panicked glances. AmeriSky hadn't grounded its fleet in over 30 years. Eleanor stood very still. This isn't Bradley, she whispered. He would never cripple the airline. Someone else has access. Someone he fears. Her phone buzzed again. Not a text, a call. CEO Bradley. And then immediately after another call appeared. VP of Flight Safety L. Rivera. 2 calls at once. 2 different hands reaching for the same flame. Eleanor declined both. She turned to Aaron. Who else has override authority? Besides the CEO, Aaron hesitated. Only flight safety operations and 1 person in financial oversight. But financial usually has read only access. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. Who's in that position now? Aaron typed frantically. A new appointment 3 months ago. Someone from outside the industry. He paused. Name's Wilson Sharp. Henry's head snapped toward Eleanor. Isn't that yes? Eleanor said voice, dropping into a colder register. Bradley's hand picked higher. The one the board approved without my vote. Grace frowned. Why would someone in finance have control over operations? They shouldn't, Eleanor said. Unless the board quietly expanded his authority. Henry's jaw tightened. Without telling you, Eleanor let the silence answer for her. Before anyone could process further, a voice shouted from down the hall, a technician sprinting towards them. Ops just flagged another priority alert, he yelled, breathless. Someone inside corporate issued a directive to lock down this facility. Every AmeriSky employee on site is to be held for internal reassessment. Grace's eyes widened. Held like detained, Aaron swore. They're trying to contain witnesses. Henry turned to Eleanor, voice cracking. Mom, they're trying to isolate you. The hallway lights flickered. The hum of electricity wavered. The technician's radio crackled again. All AmeriSky crew and passengers in Cleveland hold positions until further notice. Do not communicate with media. Await further instructions. Eleanor exhaled sharply. They're shutting the doors, she said. Closing the system. Locking down the narrative. Grace stepped closer. Voice trembling but resolute. Miss Grant, what do you need us to do? Eleanor swept her gaze across the room. Aaron, Grace, Henry, the guards, all shaken, all waiting for direction, all looking to her. Her father had once told her that a leader wasn't someone who sought power. A leader was someone people turned toward when the world began to tilt. The world was tilting now. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. We don't hide, she said. We don't wait. We take control of the communications network before corporate buries us. We gather evidence. We secure witnesses. And we expose the chain of command that allowed this collapse. Henry nodded firmly. Grace steadied her breathing. Aaron wiped his palms against his pants, bracing himself. And first Eleanor said, voice like iron. We find Wilson Sharp. Grace blinked. Why him? Because someone who fights this hard to silence an airline Eleanor replied, as afraid of the truth coming out. The hallway lights flickered again, brighter this time, casting long shadows across the floor. Eleanor Grant stepped toward the door, and with her AmeriSky's uprising began to move. The elevator doors slid open onto the restricted floor with a metallic sigh, revealing a corridor lined with frosted glass offices and the persistent hum of an operations center fighting to stay alive. Eleanor stepped out first, her presence cutting through the tension like a blade. Grace followed close behind, still in uniform, her hair frayed from hours of chaos, but her eyes burning with resolve. Henry and Aaron trailed them, checking corners, glancing over their shoulders, aware that this floor was no longer neutral ground. Ahead, a set of double doors stood partially ajar, light spilling from within. The sound of frantic typing bled into the hallway. Someone barked orders. Someone ignored them. Someone cursed under their breath. And above it all, one voice rose sharp, clipped, irritated Wilson Sharp. He stood in the center of the operations suite, like a conductor in a symphony of collapse. Screens flashed red behind him as flight paths blinked in and out. Dispatch terminals rebooted. Crew legality warnings scrolled like a storm radar. Wilson didn't look up as Eleanor entered. He didn't need to. He had been expecting her. He sensed her before he saw her. How convenient, he muttered, eyeing the tablet in his hand. The ghost owner finally appears when the system starts breathing its last. Henry stiffened. Grace swallowed hard. Aaron took a step back, but Eleanor remained perfectly still. "I'm here because the airline I own is being strangled from the inside," she said. "And you're holding the rope." Wilson let out a humorless laugh. "You think too small. This airline has been dying for years. I'm not strangling it. I'm cutting away the rot." He turned, finally facing her. His suit was immaculate despite the chaos swirling around him, his hair perfectly combed, his eyes cold, unyielding, almost triumphant. "You don't understand what this place has become," he said. "Your father built a monument to values we cannot afford anymore. Dignity." He scoffed. "Dignity doesn't buy new aircraft. Respect doesn't raise stock prices. Kindness doesn't pay the fuel bills." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice low but steady. "What you call outdated was the only thing holding this airline together." Wilson's jaw tightened. "Then it deserves to fall apart." Grace let out a sharp breath. "People are scared," she said softly. "Crew passengers ground teams. You did that?" Wilson didn't even look at her. "Collateral." Aaron's face reddened with disgust. "You shut down scheduling. You manipulated dispatch. You endangered flights. I created leverage." Wilson snapped. "The board won't listen unless they're forced to face the truth. And they won't let go of that chair you sit in, Ms. Grant, as long as they think you still possess some magical vision tied to your father's ghost." Henry stepped between them instinctively, but Eleanor gently touched his arm, stopping him. Her voice remained calm. "You sabotaged an entire fleet to make a point." Wilson raised his chin. "This airline needed a collapse. Something big enough to justify restructuring. Something to scare the shareholders into accepting what must be done." "And what must be done?" Eleanor asked. He smiled. It wasn't warm, it wasn't human. Liquidation. Divide the assets. Sell the airline piece by piece. Clear the debt. Walk away with a profit before the whole thing burns. Grace gasped. Henry's hands curled into fists. Aaron swore under his breath. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her breath did slow, controlled, almost cold. "That airline feeds tens of thousands of families," she said quietly. Wilson waved a dismissive hand. "Sentimentality. This industry isn't built on people. It's built on margins. It always has been. Eleanor stepped closer until she stood directly in front of him. "No," she said softly. "You're wrong. It's built on trust." Wilson opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor continued, her voice rising with a force the room had never heard. "My father built this airline from nothing," she said. "Every bolt, every uniform, every gate, every promise. He knew every name because he understood that an airline is only as strong as the people who carry it." She swept her gaze across the room. "And you have spent 3 months dismantling everything he built because you thought no one was watching." Wilson's face hardened. "And who's going to stop me? You walked away for years." Eleanor didn't flinch. "I'm here now." At that moment, the door swung open behind them. Captain Reynolds stepped in, still in uniform, followed by 2 Federal Aviation investigators in dark jackets. Not corporate security FAA, real authority. Reynolds looked straight at Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, "we received your message." Wilson spun around. "Your message?" What message? Reynolds handed the investigators a tablet. Everything Talbot uncovered, and the real-time system logs. "We have confirmation that the sabotage originated from terminals under Wilson Sharp's credentials." Wilson paled for the first time. "That's impossible," he barked. "My credentials were hacked." One of the investigators shook his head. "Access logs show biometric authentication, facial recognition, location tracking. So you entered every command yourself." Wilson's breath hitched rage twisting across his face. "You don't understand. This airline was dead. I was saving it." Eleanor stepped beside Reynolds. "You weren't saving anything. You were gutting it." The investigators moved. Wilson stepped back, shaking his head wildly. "This isn't over, Eleanor. This company will collapse, with or without me." She met his gaze with quiet certainty. "Not today." Wilson Sharp was escorted out, his voice echoing down the hallway as the doors shut behind him. Silence settled. Not relief, not victory. Something deeper. Something like breath returning to lungs starved of air. Grace sank into a chair, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Aaron rubbed his forehead hard, trying not to cry. Henry let out a slow exhale, old and tired and proud all at once. Captain Reynolds approached Eleanor. "Ma'am, what happens now?" Eleanor looked at the screen, still chaotic, still blinking but no longer collapsing. Now she said softly, "We rebuild." Grace stood. With us, Eleanor nodded once. "With all of you." The tension in the room didn't disappear, but something else replaced it. Resolve. Purpose. A fragile but real belief that AmeriSky might rise again, not through liquidation or manipulation, but through people who still believed in what the airline once represented. Eleanor picked up Aaron's fallen tablet, wiped the screen with her sleeve, and examined the map. Red warnings slowly shifted to yellow. Systems rebooted. Flights stabilized. Not perfect, but healing. She handed the tablet back to Aaron. "Let's get to work." He nodded, breath shaking with relief. Eleanor turned toward the window at the end of the corridor, where snow drifted past the glass, soft against the steel sky. Her reflection stared back, older, steadier, fuller than she remembered. The airline wasn't saved, but it wasn't lost, and neither was she. If this story moved, you give it a like, subscribe for more, and leave a comment with 3 words: rise with integrity.